and sort of lingering doubt. I also suggest that to really come up with a reasonable distinction between something that's obsessive-compulsive as opposed to not is to say, well, if you didn't engage in the undoing response, what would be your experience? And that, for the most part, allows people to say, okay, now I'm able to make the distinction. Examples of a pure obsessional thought would be, and a more classic example would be, let's say a new mother is changing the diapers of her child, and the thought pops into her head, take a pillow and smother the baby. That's not an unusual example. And I guess I would pose to you whether or not that's an issue for you or not. What would be your response if you had that type of a thought pop into your head? How would you deal with this type of a situation? And I know for myself, when I stand on a train platform, or when I used to, as the train would come into the station, the thought would pop into my head, jump in front of the train, just out of nowhere. Or if there were a knife on the table and I saw the knife, the thought would pop into my head, perhaps throw it at the cameraman for some particular reason. And I think that a typical response, if you're really not that savvy about the way the mind works, would be to say, well, what does this mean about me? What is my brain trying to tell me that I'm coming up with such horrendous thoughts to do myself in, to murder people who are close to me, or even just strangers who I have no particular dislike toward? And I think that if you respond in that way, you're setting yourself up for kind of some trouble. Because I would propose to you, and this is where my treatment gets a little controversial, that the brain will generate very random and very bizarre thoughts for no particular reason and without any particular underlying meaning behind them. I think that it's important to distinguish, though, that when I have the thought of jumping in front of a train or stabbing someone, my response to my sort of spontaneous brain is, that was a good one. See if you can top it. Whereas with a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, they would experience a tremendous amount of anxiety and guilt with the idea that this thought is some type of a warning about what their capabilities are as a human being. When I tell a client that I get spikes of stabbing people or poking their eyes out, they say to me, well, do you think that you could ever do that? And my response is, honestly, yeah, I do think that I could do it. I think that I'm fully capable of that type of a response, but I don't have the desire to do it. Just because the impulse or the thought hits me, that's a far cry from ever acting on it. But a common misnomer with pure obsessional thinkers is the distinction between, well, if I think it, doesn't that have some relation to my personhood? Doesn't my thoughts also reflect something about me as a human being? Like, if there are such things as bad people, doesn't the idea that I think about killing a loved one implicate that maybe I'm not such a good person? And for those people in society who believe that there are such things as good and bad people, it becomes a real quest to stop being a bad person, and that becomes a real chore for the obsessional thinker to stop having these bad thoughts. It's important to understand, for those persons who don't have obsessive-compulsive disorder, that the impulse to engage in a ritual, for me, is kind of tantamount, as I mentioned in my article, to the idea that if you have a loved one on a plane that crashes and the news says to you 50% of the people on the plane live, and you don't know whether your loved one was part of that 50%, at that moment, if someone turned to you and said, hey, I don't want you to do any thinking about finding out whether or not your loved one was a survivor, I think that's the degree of pull that a person with the pure obsessional thought experiences, to undo the question or to eliminate the recurrence of these thoughts or to try to rid themselves of the topic in general. And I think that for most people, especially family members of persons with this disorder, it's critical that they understand that the magnitude of that pull to engage in the ritual, because you often hear people who aren't sophisticated about this disorder saying things like, oh, don't worry about it, this isn't important. And I think that that can become a very insulting and alienating experience for a person with this disorder. To give you an example of the magnitude of the power of this mysterious pull, I had a client who came to me and said that he had the thought that if he didn't touch the third rail of the subway system, that impulse would never leave him. And it was so true to him that he had to act on this that he actually did touch the third rail. Unfortunately for him, the electricity wasn't on. But I've heard of people who have put themselves in a highway or on a road within oncoming traffic to touch manhole covers a certain amount of times in order to escape the thought which says, if you don't get rid of me, I will make your life absolute hell. So what do puros have in common? And I think that puros, as all other types of obsessive compulsives have in common, a pursuit of certainty and an escape or avoidance of anxiety and or guilt. I think it's important to understand that as a behaviorist, this says to me, aha, this is why people keep this disorder. Because from any anxiety response, whether it be a simple snake phobic or an agoraphobic or a person with panic attack, always the element of escape and the element of avoidance is a very powerful reinforcer to the maintenance of the problem. Because I think that you're really feeding back to your brain, this is valid, this is legitimate, and because I engage in such tremendous effort to get rid of these impulses, they must really be real and they must really be important to escape. And it kind of reinforces the idea when people say to me, I can't stand the anxiety, or I have to give in to the ritual. I think that saying things like that are incredibly self-defeating, because they're really sending the message to the brain on all levels, conscious and non-conscious, that you have no capacity to fight the problem. A lot of people look at their obsessive thoughts as a mysterious lock that they think, if I can find a key to unlock this ambiguous question or this ambiguous theme, maybe I can shut it off forever. And their brain transmits this seduction that it may really be worthwhile to engage in the ritual, because maybe I'll really be able one day to turn this off and free myself. And I think that that's a natural thing for the brain to say. With anxiety, the immediate response that anyone's brain will send to them is, find the quickest escape, find the easiest out. And it turns out that that door that says, this is the way out, this is the way that you can shut off the anxiety, when the person goes through it, is feeding the problem. And I'll talk about later what the other doors offer, but people have said to me that they know over and over again that every time they engage in the ritual that it's going to reoccur, but the impulse to just shut it off temporarily is so great that they choose it over and over and over again. And I think that it's similar with what you hear of people with addictions like cigarette smoking or perhaps alcoholism, that the impulse to engage in the sedative response is tremendous, and that's why a lot of people sometimes approach OCD and bulimia in a very similar vein, because there is that sort of sedative or addictive quality to it. But I would suggest to you that an addiction and OCD are very, very different phenomena.